Canada has a huge debt problem, and it's hidden from the minds of most Canadians. When we think of countries with debt problems, we think of Greece or the US with their constant alarms of debt ceilings and $17 trillion debt burdens and austerity measures. However, very little is said about the hidden danger lurking beneath our very quiet and polite Canadian demeanor as we drink our Timmies and load up on beer before a hockey-filled weekend. Very little is known in our country about the problems that face us. The elephant in the room I'm speaking of is Canada's ticking debt bomb. Before you click off this video thinking this is going to be about economic collapse, hyperinflation, or quantitative easing, or the failure of society outright, instead, we're going to take a rational look at the debt levels in this country. In this video, we'll be focusing on government debt, as consumer debt is a very fluid market and depends on many variables. Government debt, on the other hand, is very predictable. There's examples in history, and there's facts and figures on this, so we can actually put together a cohesive and comprehensive verdict on this issue. Currently, at all levels of government, we have a national debt of $1.8 trillion, or about 99% of our GDP. At first, this may not seem like much, especially when you compare it to other countries, like the US at 106.7%, and Singapore at 111.1%, and the UK at 92%. And this is almost nothing compared to countries like Japan at an astonishing 237.5%, and Greece at 181%. So, what is the issue with this, you say? Well, it's more to do with the economic cycle that we're in. You see, every 10 to 20 years, there's something that's called a credit cycle, where spending and borrowing peaks and declines while debt repayment rates increase or decrease depending on the point of the cycle we're in. This is evident in the US and Europe, where despite strong economic recovery and extremely low interest rates, citizens there are still deleveraging their debt loads, while the three amigos, Canada, China, and Australia, are packing on debt at alarming levels. You may be asking, why is this important? I thought we were talking about government debt, not consumer debt. Well, when consumer credit bubbles blow, governments have to spend obtuse amounts of money to rescue and bail out their economies. Right now, we're going to look at Greece and Japan, two of the most indebted nations on earth. What's extremely interesting here is the difference between these two economies and their approach to tackling their debt, and how their economies are coping with such a huge debt burden. We saw how bad it became in Greece with austerity, deep cuts in government spending, and the inability of the Greek government to print money to pay their debt, a tactic employed by most countries to inflate away a portion of their debt. They simply had to cut spending and deal with their debt the plain old-fashioned way, by going cold turkey. While in Japan, a very diverse and productive economy where the average productivity rate is much higher than anywhere else in the developed world, it doesn't seem to be very much of an issue, as their economy is chugging along just fine. This is largely in part because the government is able to print currency, raise interest rates, and lower them to deal with the debt burden in the country. This is in stark contrast to Greece, which has little to no control over the currency or interest rates as it's part of the EU. However, neither Greece or Japan has an economy anywhere near close to Canada's, so we must look elsewhere for an example. The best possible country similar to Canada is Australia, where alarm bells are ringing across the country of obscene house prices and extreme consumer debt levels. While in the US and Europe, most of these consumers are deleveraging and paying down their debts despite interest rates being near 0%. The similarities between Canada and Australia are shocking. Not only is their economy based and dependent upon resource extraction, which in 2015 took a turn for the worse, echoing much of the pain felt in Canada's oil patch. Both Canada and Australia are seeing bidding wars in their major cities, high immigration, have similar tax structures, have government-funded healthcare, and similar environmental laws. So it's safe to say what happens there happens here. However, we're all in the same boat, and it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen when none of us have been over the edge. So that's why we'll be looking at Europe and the US, where the future already occurred. In the US and Europe, due to similarities between the US and Canadian economy, we'll be focusing there. One very shocking thing is that after many of the foreclosures, bankruptcies, and stock market collapses in the days of the 2009 financial crisis, we can see the shocking aftermath of recovering from such a destructive blow to not only consumer confidence, but confidence in the market, as investors and consumers alike found very little to be happy about. This meant that the governments of Europe and the US had to literally spend trillions of dollars to deal with the aftermath of the housing and credit bubble. This doubled the entire US federal debt in the span of just 3 years. The Federal Reserve alone quadrupled their balance sheet from just $1 trillion to $4.4 trillion just to take the unwanted assets off the market. Combining the government spending and the Fed's purchase of assets off the market, this pushed nearly $8 trillion into the markets. You would think this would create unruly inflation at home, but due to the US's de facto world currency status, most of the US dollar circulates outside of the US, effectively pushing the inflation to the bank accounts and reserves of every country and corporation holding US dollars, effectively getting the world to subsidize America's recovery. Sadly, as you may have realized, Canada, much like Australia, is kind of a forgotten afterthought in the world of economics. As we will see, this will create profound issues here at home as we prepare to face our own coming crisis. Let's begin with a simple tally of all the provincial and federal debts added together, which combines for $1.8 trillion, as I said earlier in this video. Let's add in the consumer debt levels so we can get a greater picture of exactly the monster we're dealing with. Adding in $2.02 trillion in total consumer debt, we're looking at an astonishing figure of $3.6 trillion. That's effectively 2.25 entire Canada's worth of economic output. The reason debt figures like this are so important is because, as a country, it puts us at a strategic disadvantage as we are nowhere near superpower status like the EU, China, and the US, which economies make up huge percentages of world economic activity. If our economy slows down even a bit, our interest rates rise even a minute amount, this puts tremendous debt burden not only on consumers but the government themselves. Since the government by far is the largest spender in any economy, we need to go in depth to understand exactly the severity of this issue. Essentially, all government spending is a derivative of the private sector. The private sector, whether you're a libertarian or a die-hard socialist, is the sole producer of all wealth and value in the economy. This has nothing to do with political views, and it's a simple fact. People and societies produce value from resources, goods, and services. Even with government-run enterprises like Canada Post, they wouldn't even exist without government-subsidized monopolies. The only time we interact with government institutions are when they are subsidized or monopolized, like the LCBO, Canada Post, using roads and services that we simply cannot get around using. All government spending is a direct result of taxation on the productive capacity of every working person, corporation, and small business exchanging goods and services. This means that the government more or less simply spends a portion of your earnings. So it's no wonder that raising taxes is such an unpopular notion that it's easier to go to war than it is to raise taxes in your own country. There is, however, two ways around this. Simply by spending more money than you take in from taxes to win votes and get elected. For a politician, this is the best of both worlds. However, we must understand the implications of this, known as deficit spending. This money obviously came from somewhere and can originate in one of two forms: through inflation, essentially a hidden tax on your wealth that no citizen can escape, or borrowing money to spend into the economy, and this by far is the most popular form. What's most important is that this money comes from private investors and institutions who buy government bonds known as Canadian savings bonds, which are trusted for their safety and security but pay extremely low interest as a result. In some cases, this can actually fall below the rate of inflation, and therein lies the flaw with deficit spending. Someone had to save this money in order to loan it to the government in the form of a government bond. And if you, oh wise politician, happen to be a spend-happy prime minister who thinks budgets balance themselves, you can easily fall into this false sense of security wherein the public's purchasing power isn't decreased, as well their taxes aren't increased. This allows you as a politician to greatly increase spending on whatever programs you see fit, even if they don't really seem to do anything at all. But I'll let you be the judge. The best way to understand government debt is to see it as borrowing from the future to pay for the present, and sooner or later that future will come. Currently, at all levels of government, we are spending $60.8 billion a year on interest. This is simply an insane amount of money. Just to put this in perspective, with this amount of money, you can triple the spending on Canada's military and still have money left over. This also means that you can pay all of Ontario's healthcare costs and still have money left over to give every single man, woman, and child in the province of Ontario, a province with 13 million people, $700 each every single year. What makes this even more mind-bogglingly insane is that these figures are taken when interest rates are at an all-time low. Ontario alone, which has a debt burden of $256 billion, has an interest expense of $19 billion alone. This is more than what the Ontario government spends on the entire education system, from kindergarten to post-secondary. And this only proves to get worse. You may think that the investors who loan this money to the government are making off like bandits, but this couldn't be any less true. For example, if you loaned the Canadian government $1 million in a 1-year bond, you would be paid $7,000 when that bond reaches maturity. Let me reiterate, this is a measly return of 0.007%. If you invested this same money in the market in extremely safe and stable stocks, they would average about $70,000 in return. This is about 10 times the amount you would ever get from a Canadian government bond. So for the viewers that think that such reckless spending can continue forever and interest rates will never rise, despite the fact that the US is expected to raise rates 4 times in 2017. And of course, Stephen Poloz is making any reason not to put his boss in a cold tank of reality. He will single-handedly destroy the value of the Canadian dollar as investors seek yield elsewhere in the world. The simple exchange of billions of investable dollars out of the Canadian market will flood the world with Canadian currency. Since we are not a reserve currency, we will feel every bit of inflation here at home, as our purchasing power will be diminished as billions of dollars leave the country in seek of yield. This is not a conspiracy. This is simply market forces and economic fact. And since interest rates are mechanically tied to the value of stocks in any economy, not only will this push interest payments for the Canadian government up, this will also affect the value of the investments that we hold in our investment accounts as well. Combine this with the ultra-hot housing market, and any possible decline in there will create the single largest decline in household wealth in Canadian history. You cannot force investors to accept 3% interest here when other countries are paying 5% yield. This causes a catch-22 as the government pays more interest on their debt, all while trying to raise taxes on a population already reeling from cut government spending and having to pay down their own debts. This creates a dangerous deflationary spiral where almost any society in any country never fully recovers from.